Welcome back. So a new report from the UN climate change shows that countries are bending the curve of global greenhouse emissions downward. But it also underlines that these efforts remain insufficient to limit global temperatures rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. These findings we also just heard from Yasmin from the IEA. According to the report, the combined climate pledges of 193 parties under the Paris Agreement would increase emissions by 10.6% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels, and could put the world on track for around 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming. How can we keep the 1.5 degrees within reach? And how can we then break down these ambitions into clear, actionable steps to ensure that all countries, companies, and individuals understand the challenges and play their part? That's what we want to try and figure out today. And we have 4 experts joining us to answer that question. First up, we have Benedikt Gerber. He has a background in portfolio management from a biomethane company, business development for energy services, consulting, training and advisory at various energy organizations, and is now managing director at eQuota, a Berlin-based startup best described as the Amazon marketplace for regulated environmental products and markets. Their focus so far has been enabling and standardizing transactions in and trading of greenhouse gas emissions quotas, from e-mobility to biomethane, in Germany and Austria. But they're about to expand in various European markets and become a one-stop shop to handle all processes relevant to sellers and buyers. Benedikt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Greta. Really happy to be here. Excited.
Great. Me too. We also have Michael Villa, who has been the executive director of SmartEn since January last year. Before that, he was leading the advocacy efforts of the association as head of policy. He has more than 10 years of experience in shaping EU energy policies as a consultant, working for multinational corporations and a large spectrum of European associations. He has also worked in the European Parliament and at the Embassy of Italy in Denmark during the UN COP15. SmartEn, which stands for Smart Energy Europe, is the European Business Association, integrating the consumer-driven solutions of the clean energy transition. Their 75 members deploy on-the-market solutions to activate the demand-side flexibility of all end users, responsible for 13 gigawatts of flexible capacity across 15 European countries. Michael, pleasure to have you here today with us.
Thanks a lot, Greta, and thanks, gridX, for organizing this good discussion.
Our pleasure. We also have Serafin von Roon, who has worked at the Forschungsgesellschaft für Energiewirtschaft, or FFE, or in English, the Research Association for the Energy Sector, for more than 19 years. And he's been the managing director for 11 of those. The group advises customers from industry, the energy sector, and the public sector on all issues relating to the energy generation, distribution, efficiency, and savings. Serafin, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here and I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Great, so are we. And finally, we do have Rigmor Haga, but I'll introduce her and hopefully she'll be joining us, is Easee's Sustainability Director. She's worked with sustainability and social responsibility in various forms since 2007. She worked in a number of industries, from oil and gas to food and textiles, before landing in green tech at Easee in October last year. Here she leads the sustainability department, whose purpose is to convey and manage the sustainability impacts they face by focusing on people and the planet throughout Easee's operations and production. Easee develops innovative solutions for charging and power management of technology to provide an ecosystem that will give customers a seamless experience from A to Z. Their ambition is to become one of the largest companies in green tech in the world by 2031 by shaping the future of electricity. Rigmor, I think we have you here?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's go straight into the discussion. Benedikt, what is holding us back from becoming carbon neutral by 2050? And how can we translate emissions reductions into concrete steps?
Thanks for that question, Greta. I mean, yeah, it's such a multifaceted question. I would say the simplest answer is twofold. I would say, for one, it's ourselves by in terms of how seriously we take as a consumer, as companies, the mobility and energy transition in terms of switching to more sustainable means of mobility, such as EV mobility, gas mobility, through biomethane or through hydrogen, of course. There is a lot of regulation, on the other hand, that's holding us back as well. I mean, if you look at the one graph that I was thinking of bringing with me, which is quite devastating, in fact, is the amount of CO2 emission reductions in the mobility sector that we've achieved in the past 20 years, which is basically 0%. And if you look at other sectors such as the energy sector, real estate, they've come along and far away, a long way, and come far so far in their efforts to reduce emissions. But from our standpoint, especially as eQuota, as you mentioned, trading and processing transactions within a lot of different quota products. So what does that mean? Basically, certificates of CO2 emission reductions, or GOOs or the likes, or for example, emission certificates from biomethane. You can see how difficult a process it is that companies have to go through in order to be able to monetize on these emission savings, and how much of a demand side driven market it still is. So mostly we work with quota obligators, which means mostly oil and gas companies or all companies that can't meet their emission reduction targets. And that is definitely something we, as the seller side, I would say, like, because we see ourselves more of a giving access to companies that want to trade in these emission reductions. It's very difficult to get a hold of these companies, because, like, the buyer side, because it's still a very much like, you know, oligopoly, you could call it. So it's very difficult to actually be able to get access to that market at all, and to be part of the game. What I see, so I think that's definitely the part where we hold ourselves back in terms of regulation, but also if you see that companies in that field still rather want to work with someone from that side, like from the buyer side, and go directly to them, and I always call it bow to their demands, rather than trying to actually build a market there. I mean, I was part of the biomethane craze, and about 10 years ago, when something of market structures started occurring, and you could see it's always very difficult to work with or against the establishment. Both ways are not really, like, competition is not really something that is usual for them, meaning that they rather, like, they have a very linear approach to the whole market, and still think in the same ways. I feel like, or at least in the trading, it still feels like we haven't come very far in the past 15-20 years. So for us, very concrete steps are making this market as accessible as possible to households, consumers all around the world, but also especially companies that we make sure they get paid as much as possible by the buyer side, in order to actually get the transition moving.
Thank you, Benedikt. And Serafin, moving on from that, are specific targets for EVs, PVs, heat pumps, and so on, ambitious and holistic enough? Do they align with the overarching emissions reductions targets?
Yes, but maybe before I come to this point, some additional points to the good things Benedikt says. I think there are also two strong forces which are holding us back in the history, and it's First thing is there are something like natural exchange rates in some areas. The extremist is in the housing, where normally you do a refurbishment only every 100 years, so 1% per year. You can say it's only once per 100 years. So this is much too slow. Or in the industry, we have sectors where the natural exchange rate is something like 40 years and so on. That's very. And the other thing is for sure what we have learned. Everybody, I think, the cheap natural gas price we saw in the history. So now we see the additional cost to move away from this, and now it's changing. Yeah, but now to your question. Yeah, the ambitious goals. So now in Germany, I start with Germany. We have this new government, and they set up a new set of really ambitious goals until 2030. And if you look into the climate neutrality scenarios as we calculate them, you can say these goals are on track. So first part of the questions, I would say these goals for Germany are ambitious enough if you want to achieve climate neutrality until 2045. But maybe they are not holistic enough to the second part of your question, because a lot of comes with them, like grid extension. So there are not specific goals for grid extension, but a lot of goals for renewables. And so I think you can do it better. And I think the main problem is that if you look into the goals, and they look nice, like 6 million heat pumps until 2030 in Germany, or 500,000 per year, or 15 million electric vehicles until 2030, or 215 gigawatts PV, and 115 gigawatts onshore wind. So that looks nice, and then you have to decide, is this a lot? It's achievable, and then you can look at the historic data. And then you say, for example, PV, in the last 10 years, the average increase was 4 gigawatts. Now we need 17 gigawatts per annum. And we know that the first 2-3 years, we cannot accelerate it so much. So in the end of this decade, we need maybe 22 gigawatts per year. So this is a huge increase of installation, and then we see all the problems which come with it. So like labor. So now we have a big discussion in Germany about labor. So we see the goals, but right now it looks very difficult to decide if we can achieve these goals, and we have to put more into it, just the goals, and say money, because now we see we need labor, we need the resources and everything else. But I would say if we achieve these goals, the government set until 2030, it would be a good way to come to climate neutrality. We would be on track, yes.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, can you give a little bit more insight into the European-wide landscape in terms of targets?
Yeah, sure, Greta. Indeed, I'm based in Brussels, and so I have a pretty good overview of what's happening across Europe. And in particular, I can confirm that there are still some legislation that are not in line with the Paris Agreement. And I want to give just 3 examples. The first one is on several capacity mechanisms that are existing in different member states that are still subsidizing fossil fuel production, which would not have been, it would not make economic sense if they would not have these public subsidies. Another example is what is happening now in the Iberian Peninsula, where indeed subsidies are introduced to support gas power plants to reduce the electricity prices. And the very recent example is now in contemplation in Italy, following the formation of the new government, where indeed the government wanted to explore and to set new rules to allow permission to exploit the offshore natural gas reserves. So these are all initiatives, rules, and instruments that are not compliant with the clean energy transition. And the reasons is mainly because decision makers, so both policy makers, but also system operators, are reluctant to fully embrace the disruptive changes that are inherently related to the decarbonization and the clean energy transition, because this is rely on digitalization and decentralization, which require reliability, trust on digital services, on digital device, and on consumers, on local communities, on really a decentralization of the energy systems. And this really require a change in mindset, require some also new rules to allow these players to have a role. We can say that these rules at European level have been already set in some principles, but then it's a question of implementation of these rules and the question of reliability, trust, and change in mindset is also something that needs to be paced in across the different capitals.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Michael. And Rigmor, could you provide a bit more insight into companies' perspectives of, that mindset change that Michael was just talking about? How can we keep companies to account and ensure that they're making truly sustainable changes across the value chain?
Yeah, I think it is a problem that sustainability is still seen as an expense for many and not necessarily as an investment for the future. So there is a balance there between the long-termness of sustainable and sustainability investments, which for many are still seen as an obstacle or an incompatibility with the benefit of getting something immediately in short term. There is actually research, though, that shows that sustainability, when you treat it as an opportunity, it can generate quite good business performance. So I think there's a mind shift involved that we need to take on board with us, and that needs to become a lot more mainstream in education around that. And from a practical perspective, I also think that we are still lacking a lot of common scope and methodology and expectations. Scope 3 and 4 emissions, they're often fuzzy. There's a lot of stakeholders to engage. Value chains are long and complex, so we also need the industry need to work together in not just the why, but also the how, and how we verify carbon counts and how we verify the numbers of our emissions and how we take ownership to fixing them. And I also think there's a couple of things that we can do to adopt things better. I think there's also the need to understand impact. I know that this is about decarbonization. The sustainability is broader than that, and things are interconnected a lot. Of the environmental and social aspects. So moving to an extent where the purpose is managing impact and not necessarily just reporting for the benefit of investors is quite key. And that takes me back to the collaboration and multi-stakeholder initiatives, which I am quite fond of. And one thing as well that I think affects businesses and also the European Green Deal per se is the fact that the value chains, they are long and complex and they go way beyond Europe. So when we are talking about decarbonizing Europe, I think we actually need to be quite aware of the complexity of where emissions come from, because if what we end up doing is pushing emissions to developing economies or down the supply chain, the planet doesn't care where the emissions come from. So we need to think, even though this is about making Europe carbon neutral, we need to think about the impact on a global scale and make sure that we have the full understanding along the whole value chain. It requires a lot of collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. Collaboration is certainly key. And in line with that, this is an open question, but maybe starting with Michael, do you think we should have different requirements for different countries in the EU or integrated goals? How can we make sure that everyone is decarbonising?
Yeah, we certainly need harmonized European rules in climate, in energy, in environmental policies. Otherwise, market players that will need to provide the solutions, both technologies and services on the market, will not be interested in getting into 27 very different national frameworks. We need to have a real internal market for the promotion of these services and technologies. So we need definitely to have harmonized rules, but this does not mean that we need to have one size fits all law. We need to allow adaptation to the different national and even regional circumstances and energy mixes. But the principle is to agree on some rules, on some target, on some direction of travels, which needs to be shaped in the European Union policy framework. Then the issue, as I was also mentioning before, is to make sure that member states are then implementing and respecting these European rules. And we have a lot of experience where indeed we have these harmonized and agreed European frameworks, but then member states are not complying on this. And this is creating a problem for this market-based, consumer-centric clean energy transition that we need to achieve in really rapidly.
Benedikt, you raised your hand. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's actually a great point that Michael is making, and I'm a little torn on that because I totally agree with what you're saying. For me, the problem is that I see you either need an integrated goal and then a way of, because I mean the actual delivery, the lawmaking is going to happen in the countries. I mean, even in a country like the United States, where the integration of a federal system is way more advanced than ours, they still have like different approaches in every state, and that's just a country. And the European Union is not even that far along, especially if you look at the state of the digitization that we see, because that's the problem. I mean, that's our raison d'être, if you want to put it that way. Like we exist because it's such a problem to scale the approaches of delivering on these different regulations that you have in all the countries, which wouldn't be such a big problem if I could just access, let's say, through an interface, an API-based data stream with any kind of registry, but that's simply not possible in most countries, and that's ridiculous. Like that, I totally agree with you that is something we need to achieve, because that's also the reason why there hasn't been any large-scale and international solution so far, for example, for the trading problem that we're addressing, or the transaction problem, because then also the redistribution of the resources and the wealth is not going to be possible towards those that actually impact the change and that need to be supported for that. So absolutely with you, Michael. My problem is we haven't as societies, and especially as lawmakers, we haven't been able, or like looking from their perspective, they haven't been able to lay the groundwork for that from what I've seen. That also means we have to push them in that direction and bend the way of making this happen in the way, like, as far as we can.
And Serafin, you obviously work mostly within Germany, but what's your perspective on this matter?
Yes, I can say that for Europe, I think that the meaning of collaboration will increase dramatically, because in all the scenarios you see that the energy system only works or only is affordable if we work together. So we need the PV plants in the southern part, we need the windmills in the northern part, we need to produce hydrogen, to build new pipelines through Europe. So I think it's absolutely important that we see it in the European society as one project. And I think it's on the political area, it's difficult, because sometimes if you hear the politicians and so talking about the issue, then sometimes it's seems more like a competition, and we have our goals, and especially in Bavaria, then we set a new goal, then we have 2050 in Europe, then we have 2045 in Germany, and then Markus Söder says, now we make it in 2040. So it's more like a competition, but now we are all looking on the security of supply. We see how important collaboration is, and I'm a little bit afraid of, because I mentioned before that I think one really big issue is the labor force we need to do all the things, and Germany is rich, so probably we use a lot of the labor forces of Eastern Europe to refurbish our houses, to build the heat pumps, and etc. But it doesn't help the climate if we have the old housing stocks in eastern part of Europe, because no one is there to refurbish their houses. So I think there we need a European solution, for this problem.
Mm-hmm. And Benedikt, how can we better align emissions reductions and opportunities for cost savings, or even find new revenue streams?
Well, I would say the easiest approach on a European level, you can see working with the EU trading scheme. In that sense, something along the lines needs to be happening for more markets than just like putting a price on carbon and basically taxing that in that sense. And I mean, Serafin put it very well, because I think it's about collaboration in that sense, especially between the different markets, because for me as well, what came through my previous answer maybe, and what Michael stated, there is no such thing as a European like market for these different or that happens under this regulation. So because it's only a directive, the Renewable Energy Directive, there is no like common incentive for cross-border fertilization, I want to call it, because every single company is dependent on someone they have to go through in order to be able to, for example, if they want to participate in for example, making their valuable emission reduction to monetize it in one country, and they're gonna have a totally different approach, or at least somewhat of a different approach in another country. And it's easier that you need to make it easier for such players as us to enter these different markets, and not give it, like, for example, if we want to do the same thing we do in Germany for the GHG quota trading in Austria, we needed to register actually a charge point in Austria to be able to help other companies to monetize on GHG quota, which doesn't make sense, because it's just putting another obstacle in your way. And on the other hand, if you don't want them to go through us, for example, you need to help them to access the market more easily. And I don't see that happening, because it's still a lot of protectionism going on, and also in the minds of a lot of trading companies that I see, they perceive us as a threat and not as someone that wants to work with them, even though we want to. But they are more concerned with their data security, and that we might approach their clients instead of looking at the upside that's there, that together we could definitely access more markets and redistribute the revenue that's there. And I mean, there is a lot of ways under the Renewable Energy Directive to access more ways and to incentivize companies to save on these emissions, because they need to be able to monetize them. Yeah.
And Rigmor, you've raised your hand. Do you have a point to add to that?
So, sorry, I had a thing popping up on my screen. Yes, I did want to just follow up on that, because I think incentivizing innovation is quite key if you're going to succeed with this. In Norway, we have a history of subsidizing oil and gas exploration on the Norwegian continental shelf in order to attract companies. And I'm thinking about the possibility of making it more attractive for companies to do more research, development, support the scalability of this make or break technologies that we are going to need. So for example, energy storage. When we're able to store renewable energies, it will have a massive impact on how quickly we can decarbonize. And I think incentivizing that type of actions could actually help tremendously.
Yeah, absolutely. I think holistic approach is very key. Going on from that, Rigmor, obviously climate targets can only be met if we make switching to sustainable solutions really easy, cost efficient for consumers and companies. So how can we encourage consumer-centric engagement and guarantee that we scale and reach our emissions targets?
It's a very good question. And I have to say, I also think it's a bit too easy to wait for the customers and consumers to drive this change. I think we need a systemic change, and we need to be aware that quite a lot of consumers won't actually have necessarily the insight into every single thing they buy or purchase to know what sustainable choice is best, most sustainable or even possible. So I actually think that, especially within energy, solutions need to be autonomous and efficient. It's a bit like good design, right? I don't want to have to think about it. I just want it to work. I want it to be seamless. I don't want to have to run around my house and switch off the heating at 2 because I'm going to cook something at 3 and put the timer the washing machine. I just want things to work as smoothly as possible. And I think we have to offer that to the consumer. And it also means that we need a lot of collaboration before things get to the end in the consumer market. So, you know, in Easee, we talk a lot about our ecosystem, because this is what we are envisaging moving into, is this place where all the things that use electricity are harmonized and the load is balanced, and it should be easy for the consumer to use. Beyond that, I also believe in transparent information for the consumers, and it needs to be streamlined. It needs to be the same in this country as in this country as in this country. If you have 2 labels that look the same and they have completely different requirements to them, and the only difference is the shade of green or the shade of blue, it's really easy to fool the consumers into thinking that they are doing something really amazing with their purchasing power, and they might not actually have the insight that they need. So transparent and simple information is my other piece.
Yeah, and Benedikt, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, I just want to second that strongly, because I think Rigmor just made a great point, especially about, firstly, or 2 points actually, that I see like eye to eye with. It's so for one thing, putting the responsibility of this change on consumers and companies that are actually on the far end of the developments, it feels ridiculous sometimes, because it's always like there's a huge, like it feels like an elite that is basically shying away from this, from taking their part of the responsibility, at least on a maybe at least to pay for the pollution that they've caused. Of course, it happens for the consumers, and we're all responsible for it. But like as a person, to be held responsible for that, it's just not. It's just like it's turning it around, basically, where we should focus to start on. And I think also the idea of having concise information from one source is really a problem, also in terms of how the information is being conveyed. I mean, most authorities or registries, they're not experts on making it easy for people or companies to understand, like, how am I eligible for certain funding, maybe, or for certain incentives. And that is definitely something where there is a lack thereof within those authorities to operate differently. And I think also, like, this is what makes it so easy for polluters, especially ONG, unfortunately, in that space, to turn it around and say, like, look, we're doing the best we can, but we're not the ones responsible for it. You need to lead the change. And that's just like, we can run in circles forever like that.
But surely the point is that we all have a role to play, right? And consumers, companies, policymakers, we all, researchers, we all need to come together and kind of find solutions and all play our part. Obviously, we're not going to put the responsibility on consumers alone, but I would think that we all need to somehow contribute.
Maybe if I can jump in, this is definitely a very important point to stress. We need to go towards a consumer-centric energy system where the consumer will benefit from playing an active part in this clean energy transition and not be the victim of the decarbonization. They need to be supported by business models. They need to be supported by digitalization to automate their smart action with the energy system. And they need to be supported also for the deployment of assets, of smart, climate-friendly assets that will enable them to become more efficient, to generate renewable energy, and to interact with the energy system thanks to the signals that they are receiving. So definitely, this is where we need to go. But business models, incentives, and frameworks should allow consumers to benefit from playing these active parts, and ultimately will benefit also the system broadly. So it's a win-win.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked a lot about how we need to have kind of drastic policy changes and things like that. And, you know, almost everyone is in support of renewables in theory, but then there are certain local initiatives that block this. For example, in Bavaria, we outlaw windmills within 10 times the height of any housing. Serafin, how can we ensure that local initiatives also support these wider goals and enable this system change?
Yes, it's a tricky question. Yeah. So in the past, I think, especially in Bavaria, there were two approaches, and they weren't so successful. The first thing was participation. So there were, talks in the municipality with the people. They're explaining a lot, but also the need and everything about climate change and the benefits. And actually, it helped, but not enough. So because there were still a lot of people, they were strictly against it, and there are people who are against everything new. So it's not only renewables, not only windmills, it's not only big PV plants. They're also against the new grid extensions, and they will probably against the hydrogen and everything else. So this wasn't so helpful. And the other approach is money. So we changed the law in Germany that there will be more from the business tax from the company which installed the windmill in one municipality. So more of this business tax comes to this municipality and not to the company where it's situated. It helps also because then you can say in the municipality, yeah, here this kindergarten is financed by this PV plant or something like this. But also here, there are strong players in the rural area where they don't need the money. They don't care, that just we don't need it. So it's difficult, and it will be more difficult because in some way the politicians can at least say, let's get climate neutral. So we need 100% renewables. But in a few years we will see that's not enough, because we need much more than 100% in the rural areas to get climate neutrality overall. For example, for the big chemistry companies, or for the BMW plant in Munich, and for the big cities. So now then we have to explain them in the rural areas. 100% is not enough. You have to make 200% renewables, that we can have enough renewables in the cities. So this will be a much bigger problem I see in front of us, to explain to people why they have to build more PV, more windmills, etc. Not only for them, also for the others, for their jobs, to drive a nice car, etc., etc. And this brings me to the last thing where I've seen some positive impact. And that's the big companies or companies in these areas. If a big company comes and says, we need right now green electricity, we need right now, or at least in 10 years, hydrogen. Otherwise, we will lose in the global competition, not because of the cost, because we have to get climate neutral. So the shareholders want us to get climate neutral, and otherwise we go to Texas or somewhere else. So then the politicians and also the people live there get a little bit afraid and say, okay, now we have to do something. Now we have to invest, because otherwise we lose our jobs. It's not a nice idea to motivate people, but I've experienced that it worked. Yeah. So these are my experiences here in Bavaria.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that contribution, Serafin. And Michael, you have something to add there.
Yeah, I think that pushing on fear and would not be the best way to have an engagement of consumers or an acceptability. The best way will be indeed, as I said before, to make sure that they are benefiting from these deployment of assets, and everything should be really looking at and prioritizing the local optimization. So just to give an example, households might be against the construction of a windmill or a windmill in their countryside. But if this renewable generation is used to supply their homes, then they will have a direct incentive. So it's a local optimization that is going to benefit themselves for this construction of new assets that we need to increase in deployment across Europe. So really, local optimization by having consumers benefiting from these will be a way of overcoming some of the oppositions.
Serafin?
Maybe, yes, thanks. I'm 100% with you, Michael. So I think that's the way to go. But I've seen in the history that you can't get to the last 10, 20, 30% of people. So there's still this amount of people, and we don't know how low we have to go. Do we have to get all of them to go with us, or we say, okay, 10% it's okay, we do it. So we do it. Just we have to do it, and that's a problem. And I think in the past we have listened maybe too much to the last 5%, 10%, because if you look to this demonstration, even in Bavaria, or the people, and so that's always the same people, and they are always against everything. And if you count them, it's less than 10%. So maybe it's your approach that we motivate the other 80, 90% so much that they say to the other people on the street, hey, we do it anyway. So we don't care with your trouble and being against everything. Yeah, I don't know.
I'd be interested, Rigmor, to get your perspective on this, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about is how important communication is and education, and ensuring that people know the benefits of what they get. So rather than seeing a windmill outside of their house, they see the financial benefits that they can get from it, and the systemic benefits that everyone can enjoy. What's your perspective on that?
So I really believe in engaging with stakeholders locally. I believe in developing models where the local communities will benefit and see very clear ripple effects in a positive way for the initiatives that are happening locally. Whether it comes in terms of jobs or depending on what type of tax system you've got, I mean, that will be variables between different countries. But to draw some parallels to oil and gas, for example, we have onshore installations in Norway that have been quite attractive for the local municipalities because of the economic ripple effects it has for the region, for example. So maybe you can learn a little bit from how other industries have managed to work with local communities on energy issues. Because I understand that nobody wants to have a big infrastructure in the backyard and you have the whole NIMBY, you know, I like the energy to be clean, but I'd rather not have to see it. You know, I'm all for wind power, but not if it's close to my house. So I think we need to engage local communities in that discussion, and that the solutions that we have need to benefit the communities that will be affected from the start.
Benedikt?
Yeah, just maybe to merge that point that Rigmor just made with what Serafin said before, or adding a twist to that, because Serafin, you mentioned, so we need to make people understand and get them on board that they actually will have to, like in the rural areas, will have to basically be like more than net zero. They will have to be the ones responsible, or at least in charge of the change. And I think from that perspective, I guess it's even more important in some ways also to get like the energy transition, mobility transition further along in big cities such as Berlin, Paris, Munich, where you still don't see most buildings with PV on top, also to due to a lot of very, very stupid regulation, I have to say, in that sense. It's like it's not incentivizing, it's not getting incentives such as lower energy costs to those that actually should profit from that and then would be on board as well. Because I mean, everyone's strongly nodding when Rigmor is saying, like, yeah, they should be financially incentivized for that or whatnot. But that's just not happening in cities either. I mean, there's a panel that where 100 is going to be part of. They're doing a great job in trying to get the Mieterstrom regulation going in Germany, but that's like, it's not a lost cause, but that is as difficult as the market that we're tackling as well. So I think, like, what's your perspective on that in terms of how difficult or how easy would it be to get the energy transition along, like more, like, or get it going faster in cities?
Yeah, it's a very valid point. Thank you, Benedikt. Shifting the discussion slightly, I mean, obviously to have a clean energy system, it's a little bit more decentralized. Michael, you sent us a graphic of the importance of demand side flexibility within this decentralized system and what benefits come from it. So from your perspective, we'll just share this graphic in a second. But how can we leverage demand side flexibility to ensure that all EU member states can decarbonize?
Yeah, exactly. This is really, these are figures. I suppose that the audience is looking at them. That we calculated with the support of DNV, because they have never been calculated at European Union level. The contribution of consumers, active consumers, by unleashing their demand flexibility on their contribution to achieve the 2030 targets, and this is extremely important, both to highlight their contribution now in the current situation, where indeed the consumer, you will see that would be able, by activating their flexibility, to diminish the gas inputs, our gas import dependency. We will have savings of 16 billion in total gas costs in 2023 if consumers of all types, so from the households to the large energy intensive industry, is flexibly adapting its energy consumption on the basis of external signals. And also benefits longer in time, so in 2030. And there you can see a few figures on the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but also on the avoided investment in distribution grid reinforcement, and also in avoided investment in peak generation plants, because you are consuming in a flexible way the renewable energy that is generated. So we really need to have markets that are open to consumers, to the participation of consumer electricity markets that are open to consumers. We need to have consumers that are able to understand and receive the signals of when they need to adapt the energy consumption. And this can be done in an automated way. So going back to what Rigmor was saying before, digitalization, automation, and services, business services will help, but we need to have transparency, data access, interoperability. We need to have an homogeneous framework that is allowing consumers to interact with system operators and also with the electricity markets, so that this potential is fully unleashed.
Mm-hmm. And Serafin, what are your thoughts on the benefits and opportunities around a decentralized system?
Yes. First of all, we're going into a decentralized system, so this is not optional if we prefer a decentralized system, and it has a lot of chances and opportunities. So as we talked before, so it's a big chance to participate for the people, for the companies, and it's also a big chance, if they are participating, providing flexibilities that the overall cost decrease dramatically. We don't need so much grid extensions. We get a better number for security of supply, and so it's absolutely important that we find a way that we use this decentralized system. I think there's no other option in an optimized way, so that we still have security of supply, and we don't have too big, too big investments in grid extension and storages, etc., etc., etc. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then when we think about adding electric vehicles into this system, it obviously adds a lot more complexity. Rigmor, what is your view? Obviously, decarbonizing at the same time as decentralization, at the same time as more electric vehicles, there's so many conflicting challenges. How can we ensure that we focus on the right thing and leverage these opportunities for new energy services such as what Easee is providing?
So I think there is a lot of different challenges, but they might not all have to be solved by the same people in the same room at the same time. So I think, if you look at EVs, we can look at the targets that are set by the European Union for when they want to sell them. Maybe we can encourage them to be more ambitious. Are we able to actually start to phase out the sale of fossil fuels before 2035? Should we have a CO2 cap on specific big fleet operators? What would we actually do? Is there enough second-hand vehicles that are EV to handle the transition that we are looking for? That's the type of problems or challenges that we might want to look at within that part of the industry. Regardless of where you drive your EV, you will have to charge it, whether that's a centralized or a decentralized system. So I don't necessarily think that these aspect of the debate needs to club each other on the head. I still think that there are room for several approaches, of course, and I think there are benefits of both centralized and decentralized systems. So if you're talking about the decentralized one, having shorter travel energy gives less loss of energy. It gives less loss of nature because you don't have to expand the grid so much. It gives less vulnerability for disruption, but it also makes you a lot more vulnerable to that energy source that you are connected to. So you won't be able to balance it the same way as if you have a wider system. So there's a lot of different concerns, and I keep coming back to the fact that people need to talk, and they need to do proper impact assessments and see what's the most feasible thing for us to do now, what's most feasible for the long term, and how do all these pieces of the puzzle fit together. And there will be regional differences and political differences. That means that you might not have one size fits all in that transition. And I think understanding those nuances are quite key.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rigmor. Unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. So I'd like to just see if anyone has any closing remarks. Again, kind of coming back to our main question of how can we close the gap between ambition and action? Benedikt, do you have anything to add at the final last minutes?
Thanks for asking. That's a very, very big question you're putting forward in the as the last one. I would definitely say I would also strongly encourage educating and informing the broader public, also companies, why it's not a more difficult and possibly dangerous future that they're headed for. Also in terms of why more complicated or complex systems are not more complicated if you manage them well, and if you're what Michael is also advocating for, looking at also just the opportunities that lie there, and how you can, as Rigmor just mentioned, also make the system more stable in that sense. If you're just make sure that the interconnections are well managed. But I think in the end, for me, it also boils down to laying the groundwork. I think that's something we want to do 2 steps before we finish the first one, which is like, we're still not digital. We still don't have smart meters in Germany. We still don't see PV on the rooftops in the cities, like broad, like everywhere. I think that's like we need to have a plan how to finish that before we go the next even more demanding steps, because there's still people like Varoufakis, for example. Most people should still know him as the former Greek financial minister, who still believes that we should have a centralized system. And as long as people like that say that it's a natural monopoly, we still need to educate more and more to hold against that. And I think it's great to see that there's a lot of people willing to do that.
Thank you, Benedikt. Any final words, Michael?
Cooperation, it's extremely important between all parties. So from the consumer, from the industry, system operators, public authorities of all levels. So really cooperation is extremely important. Stimulate innovation, stimulate digitalization that can support ambition. Because without ambition and without having a positive attitude on the possibility of us to achieve this climate neutral scenario, we will not be able to face the challenges ahead.
Thank you, Michael. Serafin?
Yeah, difficult to add something new. That was perfect. So maybe something else. Something optimistic. We work a lot with companies together which wants to get climate neutral, and there are a lot of companies, big companies, they're taking this serious. And I think there, from this side, there can come a big push, because they want to get climate neutral 2028, 2030, 2035 or so. But they want to be much more fast or quick than policies. So maybe we should help them on this way to provide the green energy in form of electricity, in form of hydrogen, and then the people see that this is economical, feasible, that's providing jobs. It's a good way to go. It's not only green policies. It's the economy. It's the best way to go. It's the cheapest way. So maybe we should use this push from the economy to bring this drive also to the society. So yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Serafin. We've actually reached time, but Rigmor, do you have anything else to add?
I have one. The IPCC has very clearly stated that one key factor holding us back is the lack of private sector engagement. And I think what we really need to do is to create the same proactive ownership of emissions as we have for financial performance. It's not a trade-off between financial and environmental performance. So I think that's actually one of the key things that we need to be able to switch in people's minds, is the fact that you own your emissions the same way that you own your finances. They're yours and you have to manage them.
Really strong finishing point. Thank you so much, Rigmor. And thank you to everyone who's taken part. We'll be back in 2 minutes talking about the gas crisis.